Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back in time, pulling on rough wool uniforms, feeling the damp seep into our boots, and experiencing the daily grind of a soldier in World War II. Imagine, just for a moment, you're there. Not in the thick of battle, not storming a beach or holding a trench under fire. We'll touch on those moments, sure, but tonight, we're focusing on the living. The relentless, often uncomfortable, utterly exhausting business of simply existing day to day when your entire world is dirt, danger, and the vague hope of getting home. You're cold, you're tired, you're probably filthy, and your stomach is rumbling. You probably won't survive this, but for a few hours, you can feel the weight of it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your hand reaches into a stiff, waxed cardboard box. It's rectangular, about the size of a small brick, and rattles faintly. This is it. This is breakfast. Or maybe dinner. Or supper. It's the legendary, often reviled K-ration. Developed in the late 1930s by physiologist Ansel Keys, yes, that Ansel Keys, the one later famous for dietary studies, the K-ration was initially intended as a temporary or emergency ration for paratroopers and other troops operating independently for short periods, maybe 24 hours. It was supposed to be lightweight, compact, reasonably nutritious, and ready to eat. The idea was sound, but the reality, well, the reality was that the K-ration became the staple diet for countless soldiers for days, weeks, sometimes even months on end, far beyond its intended use. Let's pry open that box, shall we? You tear at the tape, the stiff cardboard protesting. Inside, you find a few smaller packages, each wrapped in cellophane or more wax paper. There are 3 main versions of the K-ration, ostensibly for different meals: breakfast, dinner, which meant lunch, and supper. But honestly, after a few days, it all started to blur into one monotonous experience. The contents were surprisingly consistent, designed to provide around 2,800 to 3,200 calories per day if you ate all 3 units. That sounds okay on paper, right? Sufficient energy for marching, digging, and generally being miserable. But calories are only part of the story. Let's look at your breakfast unit. You pull out a small can of processed meat. It might be something vaguely resembling pork and egg yolk, or perhaps meat and vegetable hash. You eye it suspiciously. It's cold, congealed, and smells industrial. Alongside this, you get some rather dry, hard biscuits, often called biscuits type C, but nobody called them that. They were just biscuits. Good for breaking teeth or maybe using as small, edible digging tools in a pinch. There's usually a compressed block of something sweet, a fruit bar or a block of processed cheese product. Plus, a packet of instant coffee, often terrible, a couple of sugar cubes, and maybe a stick of chewing gum. Oh, and cigarettes. Always cigarettes. Even for the non-smokers, they were currency. Moving on to the dinner unit, lunch. Another small can. This one might contain processed cheese, or perhaps some sort of sausage product. More biscuits, naturally. A small packet of bouillon powder, beef or chicken flavored, which you could try to mix with hot water if you were lucky enough to have it, or just chew on like a salty, grainy candy if you weren't. There might be a few hard candies, and more chewing gum and cigarettes. Starting to see a pattern? Finally, the supper unit. Yep, another can of meat. This one might be pork loaf. Or maybe beef and pork loaf. Exciting variations. You also get a chocolate bar. Now, this was often the highlight, but it was a special, high melting point chocolate designed not to turn into a puddle in the heat. This meant it was usually dry, crumbly, and tasted functional, rather than pleasurable. More biscuits, of course. And often, a packet of powdered lemonade or orange drink, a welcome change from the blandness, though it tasted intensely artificial. And yes, more cigarettes. You're looking at these items, laid out on your poncho or the muddy ground. This is your fuel. This is what's supposed to keep you going through freezing nights and sweltering days. The sheer monotony of it quickly became soul-crushing. Every meal, the same few items, just slightly rearranged. The taste? Let's just say the term, mystery meat, was earned. The processed foods were bland, often greasy, and lacked any freshness or texture variety. The biscuits were hard enough to hammer nails with. The cheese was waxy and unyielding. The only real flavor came from the cigarettes and maybe, that artificial fruit drink. Soldiers quickly grew to detest the K-ration. It was lightweight and portable, fulfilling its original brief, but as a sustained diet, it was a disaster for morale and often, eventually, for digestion. The lack of fiber, the processed nature of the food, and the sheer repetition led to widespread constipation. Yes, you heard that right. Constipation was a major, uncomfortable, and rarely talked about problem for soldiers living on K-rations. Historians still argue whether the K-rations' poor palatability and nutritional shortcomings, beyond just calories, significantly impacted troop effectiveness or if soldiers simply adapted and supplemented as best they could. A quirky tidbit: soldiers got creative with the K-ration components. The canned meat could be heated and mixed with the bouillon powder for a slightly more palatable stew-like substance if they had a way to heat it. The biscuits could be crumbled into hot water to make a sort of gruel. The fat skimmed from the top of the canned meat could be used for, well, not much good eating, but maybe for lubricating something. The cardboard boxes themselves were useful for starting fires or writing letters home. Resourcefulness was key to surviving not just the enemy, but the daily grind, including the culinary challenges. You learned to appreciate the smallest things, like a slightly less stale biscuit or a packet of coffee that actually dissolves. This wasn't gourmet dining. This was survival fuel, packaged for portability, and consumed out of necessity, day after grueling day. It's a far cry from the hot meals you might imagine soldiers eating, which were a rare luxury we'll get to later. For now, this humble, often despised, little cardboard box is your lifeline. So, you've just endured the K-ration experience, the dried biscuits, the waxy cheese, the mystery meat in a box. Your stomach might be protesting, or perhaps it's just numb to the whole affair. But sometimes, just sometimes, relief arrived in the form of something a little heavier, a little bulkier, and potentially hot. This was the C-ration. Unlike the K-ration, which was designed for short-term, lightweight use, the C-ration was developed for more sustained combat feeding. Think of it as the slightly older, slightly more substantial sibling to the K-ration. It wasn't gourmet by any stretch of the imagination, but after days or weeks on Ks, getting your hands on a C-ration felt like hitting the culinary jackpot, or at least winning a consolation prize in a particularly grim lottery. The C-ration came in cans. Lots of cans. A typical day's ration was packed into 3 units, similar to the K-ration, but each unit consisted of 2 cans, an M unit, that's M4 meat, or the main course, and a B unit, that's before bread, or biscuits and dessert. Plus, an accessory packet. The M units contained the bulk of the calories and protein. These were small, cylindrical cans filled with various concoctions. You might get meat and beans, meat and vegetable hash, meat and spaghetti, pork and beans, beef stew. Or the legendary meat and vegetable stew, often just called stew, meat, beef, with vegetables, in officialese, which sounds excitingly specific, doesn't it? Like you could really taste the difference between that beef and some other, less official beef. Opening these cans required a special tool, one that became almost as iconic as the rations themselves, the P38 can opener. This tiny, simple piece of stamped metal, less than 1.5 inches long, hinged onto a small cutting blade, was your key to survival. You'd use the blade to puncture the can lid repeatedly, walking it around the rim until you could pry the top off. It was fiddly, sometimes painful if you slipped, but utterly essential. Every soldier was issued one, and they were often attached to dog tags or keychains. The P38 was so ubiquitous and useful, not just for cans, but for cleaning fingernails, scraping mud, even adjusting rifle sights in a pinch, that it earned its famous nickname, supposedly because it took 38 punctures to open a C ration can, a claim historians still debate, though it certainly felt like 38 sometimes, or perhaps after the P-38 Lightning aircraft. Either way, this little piece of metal was a soldier's best friend. Once you got the can open, you were faced with the contents. The M units were robust. The meat and beans was often the most popular, a hearty, if somewhat bland, mix. The stews could be decent, especially if you could heat them. The hash was often viewed with suspicion. And the infamous ham and lima beans. Let's just say it was widely considered the absolute bottom of the barrel. Getting a can of ham and limas was like drawing the short straw in the ration lottery. Soldiers would trade anything, cigarettes, chocolate, even other less desirable rations, to avoid eating ham and limas. Anything was better than ham and limas. The B units were less exciting but provided necessary carbs and a touch of sweetness. They usually contained those same hard biscuits you knew from the K rations, maybe a fruit bar, and sometimes a small can of something sweet like jam, peanut butter, or a rather dense, fruitcake-like item called compressed cereal bar. Occasionally you might get a small can of dessert, like pineapple rice pudding, or chocolate nut roll, which were rare treats. Here's where the C ration really had an edge over the K, the potential for hot food. The cans could be heated, either over a small hexamine stove, a tiny, folding metal frame with solid fuel tablets, or, more often, just in a fire built from whatever was lying around. Heating the contents transformed them. The congealed grease would melt, the flavors, such as they were, would become more pronounced, and the warmth itself was a huge morale booster, especially in cold weather. Suddenly, that can of beef stew wasn't just cold, greasy protein. It was a hot meal, a moment of comfort in a harsh world. This was the main advantage of the C ration, the possibility of hot chow, even if it was just canned stew heated over a twig fire. The accessory packet added a few more necessities and small luxuries. It almost always contained cigarettes, usually a pack of 9 or 10, often brands like Camel, Lucky Strike, or Chesterfield, waterproof matches, chewing gum, sugar cubes, salt, coffee or cocoa powder, and crucially, a small amount of toilet paper. Yes, toilet paper was a standard issue item in the accessory pack. You can imagine why. Trying to maintain any semblance of hygiene with just leaves or whatever else was available was challenging. The coffee or cocoa, if you had hot water, provided another chance for a warm drink different from the bitter K ration coffee. Compared to the K ration, the C ration offered more calories, around 3,500 to 3,700 per day, slightly more variety in the main courses, even if you ended up eating the same 3 kinds repeatedly, and the crucial ability to be heated. This made it generally more palatable and better suited for sustained periods in the field. However, the sheer weight and bulk of the cans made them less ideal for fast-moving operations where every ounce counted, which is why the K ration persisted for paratroopers and assault troops. For soldiers holding a line, digging in, or moving slower, the C ration became the standard. The monotony was still a major issue, though. Eating meat and beans, or beef stew, day after day, week after week, ground down morale. Soldiers developed strong preferences and dislikes, and a complex system of trading rations emerged. A desirable can of meat and beans could be swapped for cigarettes, chocolate, or less popular items. Getting stuck with multiple cans of ham and lima beans was a genuine hardship. Historians still argue whether the C ration's repetitive nature and varying palatability significantly impacted soldier morale and effectiveness during long campaigns, even though they provided adequate calories. Was the psychological impact of eating the same bland food every day as debilitating as the physical discomfort? It's a question debated even now. You learn to appreciate the small things. A P-38 that isn't bent. A can of beans that isn't mostly liquid. A moment where you can actually build a small fire and heat your meal. It wasn't home cooking, not by a million miles, but it was fuel, it was warm sometimes, and it kept you going. And that little P-38 opener? You keep it with you long after the war is over. It's a small, insignificant thing, But it represents a time when such simple tools were literally your lifeline to a hot meal, a moment of comfort in the cold, muddy reality of the front lines. You've chewed your way through the U.S. rations, felt the waxy texture of K-ration cheese and wrestled with a P-38 opener to get at canned C-ration stew. But the Allied effort wasn't just the stars and stripes. Across the trenches, across the deserts, and across the seas, soldiers from Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, and many other nations were also enduring the daily grind, and they had their own unique set of culinary challenges and, well, let's call them opportunities. Step away from that P-38 for a moment, because the Brits had a different approach to keeping their Tommy fed. British rations were often issued in larger packs, sometimes designed to feed a section of 14 men for 1 or 2 days. This meant less individual packaging than the U.S. system, but also required more communal organization to divide everything up fairly, or unfairly, depending on who was doing the dividing and how popular you were. While U.S. troops often got individual rations, British soldiers might find themselves sharing out components from a larger box. The philosophy was a bit different, less emphasis on ready-to-eat individual meals, more on providing bulk ingredients that could, ideally, be cooked, even if that cooking was just boiling water. The cornerstone of the British field ration, the item that became synonymous with eating rough in the military, was bully beef. This was canned corned beef, and it was everywhere. You'd get cans of it, often large ones, and you'd eat it cold, straight from the can, usually sliced or just scooped out. It was salty, sometimes a bit slimy, and offered little in the way of texture, but it was protein and calories. Mixed with biscuits, it was a meal. Heated up, maybe with some powdered soup or vegetables if you were lucky, it could become something vaguely stew-like. Bully beef was the reliable, if uninspiring, backbone of the British Army diet. You learned to tolerate it, then ignore it, then maybe, just maybe, develop a Stockholm Syndrome-like fondness for its sheer dependability. Alongside the bully beef came the biscuits, similar in their tooth-breaking hardness to the U.S. versions. These were designed for longevity, not palatability. You could soak them in tea, if you had hot water, crumble them up, or just gnaw on them. They were the carb component, the edible platform for jam or bully beef, and surprisingly resilient to the elements. But where the British arguably had a significant edge over their American counterparts was in the beverage department. Tea. Tea was not just a drink, it was a ritual, a comfort, a lifeline. British ration packs always included tea leaves or tea bags, sugar, and often condensed milk. The ability to make a hot cup of tea, even in the most miserable conditions, provided a psychological boost that's hard to overstate. While U.S. soldiers were often stuck with mediocre instant coffee or artificial fruit drinks, the Brits could brew up a proper cuppa. This single item probably did more for morale than any number of canned stews. You'd guard your tea ration jealously, and finding a way to boil water, a Tommy cooker, a small stove using solid fuel tablets, similar to the U.S. hexamine stove, a mess tin over a fire, anything, became an essential skill. That first warm, sweet, milky sip of tea could momentarily make you forget the mud, the cold, and the constant danger. It was a taste of home, a brief return to civility. Other items in the British packs varied but might include tinned sausages, tinned stews, often less varied than U.S. sea rations but sometimes more palatable, depending on who you asked, jam, cheese, chocolate, boiled sweets, hard candies, and of course, cigarettes and matches. Sometimes you'd get a small tin of margarine or lard. The variety wasn't huge, and the quality was functional rather than enjoyable, but the presence of tea and jam often gave the British packs a slight edge in terms of morale boosters compared to the relentless processed nature of the K-ration. Commonwealth troops often had rations based on the British model but with local variations. Canadian rations were similar to British ones but might include different brands or slightly different contents. Australian and New Zealand troops, particularly in the Pacific, developed rations more suited to tropical climates, sometimes featuring items like canned fruit or different types of meat. The core principle remained: sturdy, non-perishable food designed to provide calories and basic nutrients under challenging conditions. One quirky tidbit about British rations: the tins themselves were often highly prized after consumption. They could be flattened and used as makeshift shrapnel shields, or used to carry water, or even cut up and fashioned into small tools or decorative items. Resourcefulness wasn't limited to U.S. soldiers. Every army found ways to repurpose the packaging of their daily sustenance. The empty bully beef tin was never just an empty tin. The constant repetition of bully beef, biscuits, and tea, while perhaps marginally less soul-crushing than the K ration, still took its toll. Soldiers craved fresh food variety, anything that didn't come out of a tin. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, was a risk on long campaigns relying solely on tinned rations, though efforts were made to include items like lime juice or vitamin supplements when possible. Digestive issues were common, though perhaps the high fiber content of biscuits and the liquid intake from tea mitigated the constipation problems faced by K-ration eaters to some extent. Historians still argue whether the British system of bulk rations versus the U.S. system of individual packs was more effective for troop logistics and morale. The bulk packs required less manufacturing effort per man but more effort at the unit level for distribution and preparation. Individual packs were easier to hand out but generated more waste and could feel isolating. Ultimately, both systems were compromises forced by the immense scale and demands of global warfare. Neither offered a pleasant dining experience, but both, somehow, kept millions of men functioning. You might dream of a hot meal cooked by your mom, but tonight, it's cold bully beef and a desperately needed cup of tea, brewed in a smoky mess tin. You've gnawed on American biscuits and sipped British tea, feeling the weight of their respective ration systems. But what about the soldiers on the other side? What was filling the mess kits of the German Wehrmacht or the Japanese Imperial Army? Their daily struggle for sustenance was just as real, often even more desperate, and certainly had its own unique flavors, or lack thereof. Stepping across the lines, you find that while the uniforms and languages change, the fundamental challenge of keeping a body running on minimal, unappetizing fuel remains brutally consistent. Let's look at the German soldier first. The Wehrmacht had a relatively robust logistics system, at least in the early years of the war, but their field rations were often designed around bulk issue and the assumption that field kitchens would be available more frequently than was often the case, especially on the Eastern Front or during retreats. Like the British, German rations were often issued per squad or platoon, requiring division among the men. The absolute staple of the German diet was bread, specifically a dense, heavy rye bread known as Kammersbrot. This wasn't your fluffy white loaf. It was dark, often slightly sour, incredibly durable, and designed to last. Soldiers would get large loaves or sections of loaves, which they would carry with them. It was the primary source of carbohydrates, and could be eaten plain, with fat or margarine if available, or used to sop up whatever else was on offer. It was the foundation of almost every meal, a constant, solid presence in a chaotic world. You might complain about its texture or taste, but you couldn't deny its staying power. It felt like it could survive a direct hit from a mortar, and sometimes, you suspected, it could. Beyond the bread, German rations included canned goods. These weren't individual, ready-to-eat meals like USC rations in the same way, but larger cans designed to be shared. You might find canned meat, often pork or beef, sometimes in a stew or goulash. Canned vegetables like potatoes, peas, or carrots were also common. The quality varied, but like Allied canned food, it was designed for preservation and transport above all else. Heating these contents was, again, a huge improvement, turning a cold, greasy mass into something resembling a proper meal, if you had access to a fire or a small stove. The Germans had their own versions of portable stoves, often using solid fuel tablets, allowing soldiers to heat water for drinks or warm up their canned rations. For drinks, coffee was standard, but like much else in wartime Germany, it was often ersatz, a substitute. Made from roasted barley, chicory, or other grains, ersatz coffee provided the ritual and the warmth, but very little caffeine and a taste that was, shall we say, acquired. It was bitter, thin, and a far cry from the real thing, but a hot cup of ersatz in the morning or evening was a small comfort. Tea was also issued, though less universally popular than coffee. Sugar was a precious commodity. Other components included hard biscuits, of course. Everyone had hard biscuits, jam, artificial honey, sometimes sausage, cheese, and chocolate. Cigarettes were also a standard issue, just like in Allied armies, serving as both a personal habit and a valuable item for trade. The variety and quality of German rations, however, deteriorated significantly as the war progressed and supply lines were stretched or cut. By the later years, soldiers were often subsisting on minimal amounts of bread, poor quality canned goods, and whatever they could scrounge. Now, shift your focus further east, to the Japanese soldier. Their rations were fundamentally different, reflecting both their national diet and the unique logistical challenges of fighting across vast distances, often on isolated islands. The cornerstone of the Japanese diet was rice. Rice was often issued in dried or compressed forms, designed to be cooked with water. This required boiling, meaning access to water and fuel was absolutely critical. Without it, the rice was inedible. Alongside the rice, Japanese rations included dried fish, pickled vegetables, miso paste for soup, and sometimes canned meat or fish. Hardtack biscuits were present here too, just as universally hard as their Western counterparts. Small sweets like kanpito, colorful sugar candies, or tamago burro, small egg cookies, were sometimes included as morale boosters. The emphasis was on lightweight, non-perishable items suitable for transport in difficult terrain and tropical climates. However, the Japanese logistics system, particularly in the island campaigns of the Pacific, was often woefully inadequate. Supply lines were long, vulnerable to interdiction by Allied air and naval power, and often failed to reach the frontline troops. This meant that Japanese soldiers frequently ran out of their standard rations. The reliance on rice, which required cooking, became a major vulnerability when fuel and water were scarce. As a result, Japanese soldiers often had to rely heavily on foraging, attempting to live off the land. This was incredibly difficult on small, often barren, Pacific islands. They would try to cultivate small gardens, hunt for whatever meager wildlife was available, or fish, but starvation became a grim reality for countless Japanese troops cut off from supply. Diseases related to malnutrition were rampant. While Allied soldiers complained about monotony, Japanese soldiers often faced the far more terrifying prospect of having no food at all. A quirky tidbit about German rations: soldiers were often issued a small bottle of schnapps or other spirits on special occasions, like Christmas or after a particularly tough battle. It wasn't a daily item, but a brief, fiery comfort in the cold. For the Japanese, perhaps the use of lightweight, foldable mess kits and chopsticks, designed for ease of use with rice, stands out as different from the forks and spoons common in Western armies. Historians still argue whether the deteriorating quality and availability of Axis rations, particularly in later years, contributed significantly to their battlefield defeats or if other factors like industrial capacity, manpower losses, and strategic errors were more decisive. It's hard to fuel an army on willpower alone, and the physical toll of poor nutrition certainly didn't help, but quantifying its exact impact compared to tanks and planes is complex. You look at the German Kammersbrat, dense and dark, or imagine the dry Japanese rice, waiting for water that might never come. It makes those waxy K-ration cheese blocks or the dreaded ham and limas of the C-ration seem almost luxurious? Okay, maybe not luxurious, but at least they were usually there. The grass, or in this case, the rations, weren't necessarily greener on the other side. Every soldier, regardless of uniform color, faced the daily, often desperate, challenge of getting enough food to simply survive, let alone fight. And often, it was a battle they were losing long before they faced the enemy. You've chewed on German Kammersbrat and imagined the desperate hunt for food on a Pacific island. You've experienced the monotonous reality of K-rations and wrestled with the P-38 for a cold can of C-ration stew. But sometimes, just sometimes, a different smell would drift on the wind, a smell that promised something entirely different. A smell that could make a soldier's heart beat a little faster, a smell that spoke of warmth, of something vaguely resembling home, of a brief, glorious escape from the tyranny of the tin can and the hard biscuit. This was the smell of hot chow, delivered by the field kitchen. Getting a hot meal at the front lines was less a daily occurrence and more a celestial event. It required logistics, relative stability, and a good dose of luck. Field kitchens were exactly what they sounded like: mobile cooking units, often mounted on trucks or trailers, designed to prepare food for hundreds, sometimes thousands, of men. They were essentially large, portable stoves and boilers on wheels, capable of turning raw ingredients, or slightly less raw bulk supplies, into something warm and edible. The crews who operated them were soldiers too, often cooks by trade or necessity, working long hours in difficult, often dangerous, conditions, sometimes under fire themselves. The arrival of a field kitchen near your position was like a minor miracle. You'd see the truck rumble up, steam beginning to rise, and a buzz would go through the men. For a little while, the constant tension would ease, replaced by anticipation. You'd get your mess kit ready, that folding metal tray or pair of nesting pans that served as your personal portable plate and bowl. You'd join the queue, shuffling forward slowly, the smell getting stronger, your stomach rumbling in earnest now. This wasn't just about calories. It was about comfort, about variety, about the simple, profound pleasure of eating something warm. What did they serve? It varied, but the staple was usually some kind of stew or soup. Large cauldrons would bubble away, filled with meat, often less than prime cuts, sometimes identifiable, sometimes not, potatoes, carrots, maybe some onions or cabbage. It was simple, hearty fare, designed to fill you up and provide energy. Sometimes there would be boiled potatoes or rice on the side, maybe a ladleful of gravy. If you were really lucky, there might be a dessert, perhaps canned fruit, or a simple pudding. The quality could be wildly inconsistent. One day it might be surprisingly decent, the next it could be a watery, flavorless gruel. But it was hot, and that alone elevated it far above the cold, greasy contents of a ration can. The Germans had their own version of the field kitchen, famously nicknamed the Gulaschkanone, or goulash cannon, because of its resemblance to a piece of artillery, and its primary output being various stews. These were often horse-drawn in the early war, later motorized, and were a critical part of their supply chain when possible. Like the Allied versions, they aimed to provide at least one hot meal a day, usually in the evening. The ability to get the Gulaschkanone forward to the troops depended entirely on the tactical situation. In static positions, it was relatively easy. During rapid advances or desperate retreats, it was often impossible, and soldiers reverted to their cold rations. Receiving your portion was a moment of simple joy. The cook would ladle the steaming contents into your mess kit. You'd find a spot to sit, maybe leaning against a tree or sitting on a rock, away from the immediate hustle. There was no leisurely dining here. You ate quickly, savoring the warmth, the different textures, the actual flavor that wasn't just metallic or waxy. You might scrape every last bit out with your spoon, the universal tool for eating field rations, whether US, British, or German. You'd wash it down with water, or maybe a hot cup of coffee or tea if the field kitchen was also set up to provide drinks. This hot meal was a powerful morale booster. It broke the monotony of the rations, provided much-needed warmth in cold climates, and felt like a tangible connection to the rear, to civilization, to a world where food wasn't just fuel but sustenance and comfort. It was a reminder that someone, somewhere, was trying to look after you. Even a bad hot meal was often better than the best cold ration. However, the reality was that field kitchens couldn't always reach the front lines. They were large, slow-moving targets, and setting them up required a degree of safety and time that wasn't always available. During intense combat, rapid movements, or when supply lines were cut, the field kitchen was often left far behind, and the soldiers were back to their tins and biscuits. The further forward you were, the less likely you were to see one. Paratroopers, commandos, or troops on deep patrols rarely, if ever, got hot chow from a field kitchen. Their world was the K-ration, or something similar. A quirky tidbit about the German field kitchens: some soldiers reported that the cooks would occasionally try to supplement the standard fare with whatever they could find locally, sometimes bartering with civilians or even acquiring livestock if operating in occupied territory. While official policy frowned on looting, the reality of keeping hungry men fed often led to creative, if not entirely legitimate, sourcing methods. You might get a taste of something completely unexpected mixed into your goulash, for better or worse. Historians still argue whether the logistical challenges of consistently providing hot meals significantly impacted troop performance and endurance during long campaigns, or if soldiers' ability to adapt to cold rations mitigated the worst effects on fighting capability. It's hard to measure the exact combat value of a warm stomach and boosted morale, but any soldier who experienced the difference would tell you it mattered immensely. So you finish your hot stew, scrape out your mess kit, and the moment of warmth and relative plenty passes. The field kitchen packs up, rumbling away to wherever it's needed next, or perhaps settling in for the night if the lines are quiet. You're left with the lingering taste, the feeling of fullness that is a rare luxury, and the immediate return to the cold, hard reality of your environment. But for those few minutes, you weren't just a soldier enduring, you were a man eating a hot meal, and sometimes, that was enough to keep you going for another day. So you've seen the official menu, the K rations, the C rations, the British bully beef, the German bread, the Japanese rice. And you've heard about the rare, glorious appearances of the field kitchen, like a culinary mirage in the desert of hardtack. But let's be real. War is messy, logistics break down, and official rations, while designed to sustain, are rarely enough to satisfy, physically or psychologically. Your stomach still rumbles. Your taste buds crave anything that isn't canned mystery meat or cardboard biscuits, and honestly, you're just plain bored of the same food, day after day. The reality for soldiers on the ground, regardless of their army, was that if you wanted something better, something different, or sometimes, just more, you had to find it yourself. You had to supplement the diet. This unofficial economy of food acquisition was a universal constant of trench, field, and jungle life. It ranged from the relatively innocent trading among comrades to outright scrounging, foraging, or even, in some darker instances, outright looting. Necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention, and a hungry soldier is perhaps the most inventive creature on earth. Trading was the most common and socially acceptable way to vary your diet. Remember those cigarettes in the accessory packs? They weren't just for smoking, they were gold. A pack of Lucky Strikes or Players could buy you almost anything in the informal soldier market. Did you get stuck with 3 cans of ham and lima beans from your C-ration issue? Find someone who, for reasons only known to them or perhaps due to temporary insanity, actually liked ham and limas, and trade them for a can of meat and beans, or even better, a rare chocolate bar. Did your buddy get a package from home with actual, fresh-baked cookies? Offer him half your cigarette ration for the week for just one. This internal bartering system was vital for morale and allowed soldiers to customize their meager provisions slightly, swapping away the items they truly couldn't stomach for something marginally more palatable. It was a dynamic marketplace where supply and demand were dictated by personal preference and hunger pangs. A soldier with a surplus of chewing gum might trade it for extra sugar cubes from someone else's coffee ration. It wasn't just food. Captured enemy items, spare socks, even letters from home could enter the trade network. Beyond trading with your fellow soldiers, there was scrounging. This was a more active pursuit. If your unit was in a static position near a farm or village, you might try to acquire eggs, chickens, potatoes, or whatever else the local population had. This was a gray area, officially frowned upon, but often tolerated by officers who understood that a well-fed soldier was a happier, more effective soldier, provided it didn't turn into widespread looting that alienated the locals. Sometimes it meant sneaking out at night, or offering goods like cigarettes or soap in exchange, if the locals were willing and able to trade. Foraging could also be a part of this, identifying edible plants or fruits in the local environment, though this required knowledge that most soldiers didn't possess, leading to unfortunate incidents of eating poisonous things. Mainstream historical fact time. While official rations were the primary source of calories, the informal economy of trading and scrounging was so widespread and essential to maintaining morale and supplementing nutritional gaps that military planners and commanders were well aware of it, even if they didn't always officially sanction it. It was a recognized, if unquantified, part of the overall sustenance strategy, a tacit acknowledgement that soldiers needed more than just the minimum to function effectively for long periods. Captured enemy supplies were another source. Finding an abandoned German supply dump or overrunning a Japanese position could yield unexpected treasures. Maybe a few cans of their food, always eyed with suspicion, but hunger is a powerful motivator, cigarettes, or even alcohol. Eating enemy rations was a gamble. You didn't know exactly what you were getting, and there was always a slight, irrational fear that it might be poisoned, but curiosity and hunger often won out. Remember that dense German Kommissbrat? If you captured some, you might give it a try, comparing notes with anyone else who'd been similarly lucky. Receiving packages from home was like Christmas morning, even if it arrived in the middle of a muddy field. Mothers, wives, girlfriends, and family members would pack tins of cookies, cakes, candy, sometimes even canned goods or dried fruits. These weren't just food, they were tangible links to the world they were fighting for, packed with love and hope. A tin of homemade shortbread could be shared among the squad, boosting everyone's spirits. Of course, these packages were irregular, often damaged in transit, and sometimes pilfered along the way, but when one arrived, it was a cause for celebration. A quirky tidbit about these care packages. Sometimes they contained things like spices or bouillon cubes, allowing soldiers to add a little flavor to their otherwise bland official rations, a small but significant luxury that could transform a boring can of stew. The risks of supplementing your diet weren't just getting caught scrounging. Eating unfamiliar local food could lead to stomach problems or parasites. Eating questionable captured rations could be genuinely risky if they were spoiled or, in rare cases, tampered with. Relying too heavily on traded sweets or cigarettes could lead to other health issues. But for many soldiers, the potential rewards of variety, comfort, and a full stomach outweighed the risks. Historians still argue whether the widespread practice of supplementing rations through scrounging and trading significantly improved the overall health and fighting effectiveness of troops, or if it was primarily a psychological coping mechanism that provided fleeting comfort without substantially altering the fundamental challenges posed by inadequate official diets. Was the extra protein from a scrounged chicken enough to make a difference in endurance, or was the real benefit simply the temporary boost in morale from eating something different? You learn to be opportunistic. You keep an eye out for abandoned vehicles that might still have supplies. You listen for rumors of a unit getting a big mail call. You become adept at sniffing out opportunities, because sometimes the difference between a truly miserable day and a slightly less miserable one is finding an extra chocolate bar or trading for a can of beans that isn't ham and limas. It's a constant hustle, a low-level game of survival played out alongside the main event, fueled by hunger and the desperate desire for something, anything, that doesn't taste like cardboard and regret. So you've mastered the art of trading that dreaded can of ham and lima beans for something marginally better. You've learned to eye discarded tins for potential repurposing. And maybe, just maybe, you managed to scrounge a slightly less stale biscuit from a buddy. You've figured out how to put food in your belly, one way or another. But fuel is only part of the equation when you're pushing your body to its limits, day in and day out, under the sun, in the mud, or shivering in the cold. You can have all the calories in the world, but without something to wash down that dry, waxy cheese or that dense Kommissbrat, you're not going to last long. Hydration, or the desperate search for it, was a constant, fundamental challenge for every soldier, regardless of their uniform. Water was life. It sounds simple, right? Just find some water. But finding safe water in a war zone was anything but simple. Streams, rivers, puddles, wells, they were everywhere, but they were also likely contaminated with everything from dead animals to human waste, not to mention the charming cocktail of chemicals churned up by artillery and vehicles. Drinking untreated water was a fast track to dysentery, cholera, or any number of debilitating illnesses that could take you out of the fight just as effectively as a bullet. A mainstream historical fact here: waterborne diseases were a leading cause of non-combat casualties in every army during World War II, sometimes incapacitating more troops than the enemy did in certain campaigns. The seemingly simple act of taking a drink was fraught with danger. So, you couldn't just gulp down water from the nearest ditch, no matter how thirsty you were. You needed to purify it. The most common method was using chemical tablets, usually containing iodine or chlorine compounds. You'd fill your canteen or mess tin, drop in a tablet or two, wait the specified time, usually 30 minutes, which felt like an eternity when you were parched, and then drink. The water would taste medicinal, like swimming pool water that had seen better days mixed with regret. It was warm, it tasted awful, but it was safe. Or at least safer. You quickly developed a powerful association between the taste of treated water and the feeling of relief from thirst. It wasn't refreshing in the way a cold drink from a tap was, but it kept you going. Boiling water was another option, if you had the means to start a fire or use a stove and had the time to wait for it to cool down enough to drink. This was often preferable for making hot drinks, but boiling enough water just for basic hydration throughout the day was rarely practical, especially when trying to remain concealed. So, the chemical tablets became your best friend, a tiny, pocket-sized guardian against gut-wrenching illness. Beyond plain water, there were the comfort drinks. For the American soldier, this meant coffee. Instant coffee was a standard issue in K rations and C rations. It wasn't good coffee. It was usually bitter, thin, and barely resembled the brewed stuff you knew from home. But if you could get hot water, a big if, a cup of hot instant coffee was a moment of warmth and a welcome dose of caffeine. It was a ritual, a pause in the chaos, a small connection to normalcy. You nursed that tiny cup, the steam rising into the cold air, just for a few minutes of something other than the grim reality of your surroundings. The British soldier, as we touched on earlier, had tea. And not just tea, but the ritual of tea. Ration packs included tea leaves or bags, sugar, and condensed milk. Finding a way to brew up a hot, sweet, milky cup of tea was paramount. Tommy cookers, mess tins over fires, anything that could boil water was pressed into service. The importance of tea for British morale cannot be overstated. It was more than just a drink, it was a symbol of resilience, a moment of calm and civility amidst the barbarity of war. While an American soldier might crave a cigarette and a coffee after a tough patrol, a British soldier craved a cuppa. It was their anchor. For the Germans, it was often ersatz coffee, that bitter, grain-based substitute that offered warmth and the idea of coffee, but none of the kick. It was a stark reminder of the shortages back home, of a nation running on substitutes. Yet, like the Allied drinks, a hot cup of ersatz provided a moment of respite. Alcohol was less of a daily staple and more of a rare luxury, or a morale boost on special occasions. Officially, issuing alcohol varied by army and situation. German soldiers might occasionally receive a small ration of schnapps. British soldiers sometimes got a rum ration, particularly in harsh climates or before an assault, a tradition carried over from the Navy. American policy on alcohol was more restrictive, though beer was sometimes available in rear areas. At the front, any alcohol was usually either captured enemy stocks or locally acquired through scrounging or trading. A bottle of wine, found in a liberated village, or some schnapps taken from a German position, would be shared sparingly, providing a brief, warm buzz that helped numb the cold and the fear, if only for a little while. A quirky tidbit. Some soldiers got quite creative with brewing their own alcoholic concoctions using whatever they could find, though this was risky and rarely resulted in anything remotely palatable. Think fermented fruit from a civilian garden mixed with sugar from ration packs. Definitely not for the faint of heart or stomach. Historians still argue whether the psychological benefits of these comfort drinks and occasional alcohol rations outweighed the potential negative impacts of caffeine dependence or occasional inebriation on discipline and health. Was the morale boost from a hot cup of tea or a shared swig of schnapps truly worth the logistical effort or potential risks? It's a complex question with no simple answer, but for the soldier shivering in a foxhole, the warmth and momentary escape offered by a hot drink or a shot of something strong felt undeniably essential. The constant need for water, the ritual of the hot drink, the rare comfort of alcohol, these were threads woven into the fabric of daily life, just as vital as the food in your mess kit. You learned to conserve water, to tolerate the chemical taste, to guard your coffee or tea ration, and to appreciate the simple fact that you had something to drink at all, even if it wasn't what you wanted, even if it tasted like regret and iodine. Because tomorrow, the endless thirst would return, and the search for safe water would begin again. You've wrestled with the perpetual thirst, the chemical tang of purified water, and the small comfort of a hot, bitter drink. Your body has been fueled, hydrated, sort of, and given fleeting moments of warmth. But look down. Look at your hands caked in mud. Look at your uniform, stiff with grime and sweat. Feel the grit under your fingernails, the itch on your skin. Because while food and water kept you alive, the constant, losing battle against dirt was the relentless, demoralizing reality of daily existence for every soldier. Staying clean in the mud wasn't just difficult, it was often impossible. Imagine living for days, weeks, or even months without a proper bath or shower. Your uniform, often made of thick wool, absorbs sweat and grime, becoming stiff and heavy. Mud gets everywhere, in your boots, on your hands, smeared across your face, clinging to your equipment. The luxury of running water, soap, and a clean towel that you took for granted back home? A distant, almost laughable memory. Your world is dirt, and you are part of it. Personal hygiene resources were incredibly scarce at the front. You might be issued a tiny, often low-quality bar of soap, probably designed to last longer than it reasonably could. A small, thin towel might be part of your kit, but keeping it clean was another challenge entirely. Toothbrushes and toothpaste were sometimes issued, but using them required finding water, and the will to bother when every ounce of energy was focused on survival. Shaving became a rare, almost ceremonial act, requiring precious water and a steady hand that was often shaky from fatigue or cold. A 5 o'clock shadow quickly turned into a full, itchy beard, adding another layer of discomfort. Finding the opportunity to wash was a logistical puzzle. If your unit was in a relatively static position near a stream or river, you might get a chance to strip down and splash yourself, but even then, the water was likely freezing, and you were exposed. Privacy was non-existent. The best you could often hope for was finding a puddle or using some of your precious canteen water for a quick, inadequate wash of your face and hands, maybe your feet if you were diligent. But the rest of you remained encased in layers of accumulated filth. It was like wearing a permanent layer of unpleasantness. The consequences of this constant state of uncleanliness were more than just discomfort and a pervasive, unpleasant smell that clung to everyone and everything. It was a serious health hazard. Skin infections, rashes, and sores were common, exacerbated by friction from rough clothing and equipment. And then there were the parasites. Lice, particularly body lice, were a universal scourge in every army. They thrived in the warm, dirty conditions of unwashed bodies and clothing, causing maddening itching and, more importantly, capable of transmitting diseases like trench fever. Delousing stations existed in rear areas, but getting access to them was a rare privilege for frontline troops. You'd boil your clothes in whatever pot you could find, or pick lice off your uniform and body, a constant, degrading battle against tiny invaders. It was like having a second, itchier army living on you. Mainstream historical fact time: trench foot, a debilitating condition caused by prolonged exposure of the feet to cold, wet, and unsanitary conditions, was a major non-combat injury in many campaigns, particularly in static trench warfare or cold, muddy environments. It could lead to numbness, pain, swelling, blistering, and in severe cases, gangrene and amputation. Keeping feet clean and dry was critical, but incredibly difficult without proper facilities, clean socks, another precious commodity, and the opportunity to take boots off for extended periods. The struggle for hygiene wasn't just physical, it was psychological. There's something fundamentally demoralizing about being constantly dirty, about the smell, the itch, the loss of dignity that comes with living like an animal burrowing in the dirt. Simple acts of cleanliness are tied to self-respect and a sense of being human. Being deprived of them, day after day, wore away at you. It made you feel less like the person you were back home and more like just another part of the muddy, grim landscape. A quirky tidbit: some soldiers would try to save small amounts of their coffee or tea ration water to use for a quick wash, prioritizing a momentary feeling of cleanliness over an extra warm drink, showing just how desperate the craving for cleanliness could be. Officers often tried to enforce hygiene standards, understanding the link between cleanliness and troop health and morale. Inspections would be held when possible, focusing on feet, the most vulnerable part of the body, and general cleanliness. But these efforts were often hampered by the sheer realities of the environment and the lack of resources. You can't magic clean water and soap out of thin air in a combat zone. Historians still argue whether the chronic poor hygiene and related health issues significantly impacted the overall fighting effectiveness of units, or if soldiers simply developed a grim resilience and acceptance of their perpetually dirty state, with the physical discomfort being just another burden to bear alongside combat stress and inadequate food. Was the cumulative effect of constant itching, skin problems, and the risk of trench foot a major factor in troop exhaustion and incapacitation, or were these seen as minor annoyances compared to the threat of enemy fire? You do what you can. You rub dirt off with dirt. You scrape mud with a stick or your P38 opener. You try to change your socks whenever possible, even if the clean ones are just as damp and cold. You endure the itching, the smell, the feeling of being utterly, irredeemably filthy. You learn to ignore it, or try to. Because tomorrow, the rain might fall again, the mud will deepen, and the battle against the dirt will continue, just as relentless and unwinnable as the war itself sometimes feels. It's just another layer of the grind, another discomfort you learn to live with, hoping that someday, somehow, you'll get to stand under a hot shower again, and feel truly clean. You've scraped the last bit of ration out of your mess kit, swallowed the last mouthful of chemical-tasting water, and perhaps managed a quick, inadequate scrub at a nearby stream, leaving you somehow feeling dirtier than when you started. The cold is starting to seep into your bones, or the heat is pressing down, depending on where you are and what time of year it is. The constant itch of accumulated grime and maybe, just maybe, the first telltale tickle of lice is starting. Your body is protesting the day's exertions, the marching, the digging, the carrying of heavy gear. Every muscle aches, every joint feels stiff. Your mind is a jumble of the day's events, the faces of your comrades, the ever-present anxiety about what tomorrow will bring. And now you have to try and sleep. Sleep. That fundamental human need, as vital as food and water, yet perhaps the most elusive luxury for a soldier at the front. It wasn't just about finding a place to lie down. It was about finding rest amidst sensory assault, psychological stress, and constant danger. The world around you didn't power down for the night. There was the distant rumble of artillery, the crackle of small arms fire, the occasional flare lighting up the sky, the sounds of sentries moving, the wind, the rain, the unknown noises of the night. Trying to quiet your mind and body in the face of this cacophony was an epic battle in itself. Where did you sleep? If you were lucky, really lucky, you might be in a barn or a ruined building, offering at least a roof over your head and maybe a slightly softer surface than the bare earth. But at the actual front, your bedroom was usually a hole in the ground. A foxhole, maybe a section of trench. It was cold, it was damp, it was often muddy, and it offered minimal protection beyond getting your head below ground level. You'd curl up as best you could, pulling your poncho or a scratchy wool blanket around you. If it was cold, you'd huddle together with your buddies, sharing body heat like a pile of tired, smelly puppies, because collective warmth was often the only kind available. Privacy? Forget it. Your personal space was measured in inches, shared with mud, insects, and other equally miserable human beings. Comfort was a foreign concept. The ground was hard and unforgiving. Rocks and roots seemed to conspire to find the most uncomfortable spots under your back. Your uniform was your pajamas, your day clothes, your everything. If you were wet from rain or sweat, you stayed wet. There was no dry, clean set of sleepwear to change into. Your boots? Sometimes you could take them off, carefully, to try and air out your perpetually damp feet, but often you slept with them on, ready to move at a moment's notice. Imagine trying to get comfortable with wet, heavy boots still laced to your feet. It's like trying to sleep wearing concrete shoes, only smellier. The psychological burden made sleep even harder. How do you truly relax when you know that any moment, an artillery shell could land nearby, or the enemy could launch an attack? Your senses were on high alert even when you were trying to rest. Every distant noise was analyzed. Was that a vehicle? Was that movement in the wire? Was that someone trying to sneak up? Your dreams, when they came, were often vivid, fragmented, and terrifying, filled with echoes of the day's events or distorted visions of home. Waking up from a nightmare into the grim reality of the foxhole could be disorienting and deeply unsettling. It's hard to get your beauty sleep when death is literally knocking at your door, or rather, your dirt wall. So how did anyone sleep? Mostly through sheer, bone-crushing exhaustion. After a long march, a day of digging, or hours of intense stress, your body would eventually just shut down, overriding the discomfort and the fear. You'd fall into a heavy, dreamless sleep, often waking hours later feeling just as tired as when you laid down, but having gained a few precious hours of unconsciousness. This wasn't restorative sleep. It was functional unconsciousness, a temporary reboot for a system running on fumes. Mainstream historical fact: chronic sleep deprivation was a constant state for many frontline soldiers. Studies conducted during and after the war confirmed that prolonged lack of quality sleep severely impacts reaction time, decision-making, cognitive function, and emotional regulation. Military planners understood the need for rest, but the realities of combat often made it impossible to provide adequate downtime, directly impacting troop effectiveness during prolonged engagements. Soldiers developed coping mechanisms. Some tried to use whatever they could find as makeshift pillows, a rolled-up blanket, a helmet, a sandbag. Others would try to block out the noise by pulling their helmet low over their ears or burying their head. The rhythm of shared watches meant that someone was always awake, providing a thin layer of security that allowed others to drift off, however fitfully. A quirky tidbit: some soldiers became so adept at sleeping whenever and wherever possible that they could snatch moments of sleep while standing up, leaning against something, or even while riding in bumpy vehicles, their bodies conditioned by extreme fatigue to seize any opportunity for rest. Historians still argue whether the cumulative impact of chronic sleep deprivation and the psychological stress of combat significantly contributed to the rates of combat fatigue, later known as shell shock or PTSD, experienced by soldiers, or if these were primarily direct results of traumatic experiences independent of sleep patterns. Was the constant state of exhaustion a contributing factor to long-term mental health issues, or simply a temporary physical burden? You learn to value even the shortest periods of uninterrupted sleep. An hour here, 2 hours there. It's not enough, never enough, but it's something. You wake up stiff, cold, and still tired, but for a little while you weren't here. You weren't in the mud, you weren't in danger, you weren't hungry or thirsty or dirty. You were simply unconscious. And sometimes, that brief escape was just enough to face another day of the relentless grind. The search for comfort, like the search for clean water or a hot meal, was a constant, often futile, pursuit. You were always just one step away from exhaustion, one step away from collapse, held together by sheer will and the desperate need to survive until the next, inadequate period of rest. You've managed to snatch a few hours of fitful, uncomfortable unconsciousness, waking up stiff, cold, and still tired, with the ever-present itch of dirt and maybe lice already beginning its irritating dance. You're fueled, you're hydrated, sort of, and you've learned to exist in a state of perpetual grime. But the challenges to your physical well-being weren't just about the lack of food, water, or sleep, or the omnipresent dirt. There was an entire invisible army arrayed against you, an army of tiny, insidious enemies that could take you out of the fight just as surely as a machine gun bullet. This was the battle against bugs and sickness. The environment itself was often your most relentless foe, and it was teeming with life that wanted to bite you, infect you, or generally make your life miserable. Mosquitoes, flies, fleas, ticks, spiders, scorpions, depending on your theater of war, you faced a different, equally annoying, cast of characters. In the jungles of the Pacific, mosquitoes weren't just irritating, they were vectors for malaria, a disease that could lay you low with fever, chills, and debilitating weakness, sometimes for weeks or months. In North Africa or Italy, sandflies carried leishmaniasis. Everywhere, Flies buzzed around latrines, often just holes in the ground, and food, spreading dysentery and other gastrointestinal horrors. It felt like the natural world itself was trying to kill you, or at least give you a really, really bad stomach ache. Beyond the biting insects, there were the parasites that lived in you. We already mentioned lice, those tiny, relentless tormentors that infested clothing and hair, causing maddening itching and capable of transmitting trench fever, a non-lethal but incredibly debilitating illness characterized by fever, headaches, and severe leg pain. Trying to get rid of them was an endless, often futile task. You'd boil your clothes when you could, try to find delousing powder, a precious commodity, or just sit there, picking them off one by one, a grim form of meditation. It was a constant, degrading reminder that you were living in conditions that allowed such creatures to thrive. You felt less like a soldier and more like a walking buffet for tiny vampires. The diseases spread by poor sanitation and close quarters were rampant. Dysentery, caused by contaminated food or water, despite your best efforts with those purification tablets, could sweep through a unit, leaving men weak, dehydrated, and unable to fight. Respiratory illnesses like pneumonia and bronchitis were common, especially in cold, wet climates, exacerbated by constant exposure and exhaustion. Measles, mumps, and other childhood diseases, usually minor back home, could be serious threats to adults living under extreme stress with compromised immune systems. It was a grim lottery. You might survive the enemy, only to be felled by a bad case of the flu or a parasite picked up from untreated water. Mainstream historical fact: in many campaigns, particularly in the Pacific and Mediterranean theaters, non-combat casualties from disease, particularly malaria and dysentery, significantly outnumbered combat casualties. For example, in the Pacific, malaria was a major threat to Allied troops, often incapacitating entire units and requiring massive efforts in mosquito control and prophylaxis, like taking quinine or atabrine, which had their own unpleasant side effects. The fight against disease was a war within the war. Medical care at the front was basic and overburdened. Aid stations were set up as close to the lines as possible, often in dugouts or ruined buildings, staffed by medics and doctors working under immense pressure with limited supplies. Their job was primarily triage, stabilizing the wounded, stopping bleeding, administering pain relief, and preparing men for evacuation to field hospitals further to the rear. For non-combat illnesses, treatment was often limited: rest, fluids if available, and whatever limited medications were on hand. A bad fever or a severe case of dysentery might mean being sent back down the chain, a long, bumpy, uncomfortable journey away from your unit. Getting sick wasn't just miserable, it meant leaving your buddies and facing an uncertain future in the medical system. Quirky tidbit: while official medical supplies were often scarce, soldiers and medics sometimes resorted to improvised treatments based on folk remedies or whatever local resources they could find. There are accounts of using spiderwebs to staunch bleeding, or trying local herbs for stomach ailments, often with questionable results. Desperation breeds ingenuity, even in medicine, though the success rate was probably lower than with trading cigarettes for chocolate. Beyond disease and parasites, there were the injuries from non-combat causes. Accidents were common: sprained ankles on uneven terrain, cuts and bruises from digging or handling equipment, burns from trying to heat rations or stay warm, even injuries from falling into shell holes or tripping in the dark. These minor injuries, which you might barely notice back home, could become serious problems in the field without proper care, easily becoming infected in the unsanitary conditions. A simple cut could turn into a festering sore. A twisted ankle could mean being unable to keep up with your unit. The psychological toll of constantly battling these unseen enemies was significant. It was one thing to face a human enemy you could see and fight back against. It was another to be constantly undermined by microscopic invaders and environmental hazards you couldn't escape. The feeling of being dirty, itchy, and potentially sick, day after day, wore down your resilience. You became hyper-aware of every bite, every ache, every change in your digestion, wondering if this was the start of something serious. It was a constant, low-grade anxiety layered on top of the high-stakes fear of combat. It felt like you were fighting two wars at once, one against the enemy, and one against your own body and the environment. Historians still argue whether the cumulative impact of non-combat casualties from disease and poor health significantly affected the overall strategic outcomes of campaigns, or if armies were generally able to absorb these losses and maintain fighting strength through replacements. Was the drain on manpower and resources from treating the sick and injured a major factor in determining victory or defeat, or was it simply a constant background challenge that all sides faced and adapted to? You learned to live with the itching, the occasional stomach cramps, the constant awareness of the potential for infection. You take your purification tablets, you try to keep your feet dry, you pick the lice off your uniform. You hope you don't get that debilitating fever, that you don't step on something sharp in the dark, that the flies haven't landed on your food. It's just another layer of the grind, another set of threats in a world determined to break you down. And sometimes, just sometimes, you look at your perpetually dirty hands and think, well, at least I don't have trench foot, yet. You've managed to snatch a few hours of fitful, uncomfortable unconsciousness, waking up stiff, cold, and still tired, with the ever-present itch of dirt and maybe lice already beginning its irritating dance. You're fueled, you're hydrated, sort of, and you've learned to exist in a state of perpetual grime, battling the bugs and diseases the environment throws at you. Your body is protesting the day's exertions, the marching, the digging, the carrying of heavy gear. Every muscle aches, every joint feels stiff. Your mind is a jumble of the day's events, the faces of your comrades, the ever-present anxiety about what tomorrow will bring. And now you have to try and sleep. Sleep. That fundamental human need, as vital as food and water, yet perhaps the most elusive luxury for a soldier at the front. It wasn't just about finding a place to lie down. It was about finding rest amidst sensory assault, psychological stress, and constant danger. The world around you didn't power down for the night. There was the distant rumble of artillery, the crackle of small arms fire, the occasional flare lighting up the sky, the sounds of sentries moving, the wind, the rain, the unknown noises of the night. Trying to quiet your mind and body in the face of this cacophony was an epic battle in itself. Where did you sleep? If you were lucky, really lucky, you might be in a barn or a ruined building, offering at least a roof over your head and maybe a slightly softer surface than the bare earth. But at the actual front, your bedroom was usually a hole in the ground. A foxhole, maybe a section of trench. It was cold, it was damp, it was often muddy, and it offered minimal protection beyond getting your head below ground level. You'd curl up as best you could, pulling your poncho or a scratchy wool blanket around you. If it was cold, you'd huddle together with your buddies, sharing body heat like a pile of tired, smelly puppies, because collective warmth was often the only kind available. Privacy? Forget it. Your personal space was measured in inches, shared with mud, insects, and other equally miserable human beings. It was like a very exclusive, very uncomfortable camping trip where everyone forgot the tent and sleeping bags. Comfort was a foreign concept. The ground was hard and unforgiving. Rocks and roots seemed to conspire to find the most uncomfortable spots under your back. Your uniform was your pajamas, your day clothes, your everything. If you were wet from rain or sweat, you stayed wet. There was no dry, clean set of sleepwear to change into. Your boots? Sometimes you could take them off, carefully, to try and air out your perpetually damp feet, but often you slept with them on, ready to move at a moment's notice. Imagine trying to get comfortable with wet, heavy boots still laced to your feet. It's like trying to sleep wearing concrete shoes, only smellier. And those hard biscuits you ate earlier? They suddenly feel like they've migrated to lodge themselves right under your shoulder blade. The psychological burden made sleep even harder. How do you truly relax when you know that any moment, an artillery shell could land nearby, or the enemy could launch an attack? Your senses were on high alert even when you were trying to rest. Every distant noise was analyzed. Was that a vehicle? Was that movement in the wire? Was that someone trying to sneak up? Your dreams, when they came, were often vivid, fragmented, and terrifying, filled with echoes of the day's events or distorted visions of home. Waking up from a nightmare into the grim reality of the foxhole could be disorienting and deeply unsettling. It's hard to get your beauty sleep when death is literally knocking at your door, or rather, your dirt wall. Your brain refuses to switch off the danger setting, even for a few hours. So how did anyone sleep? Mostly through sheer, bone-crushing exhaustion. After a long march, a day of digging, or hours of intense stress, your body would eventually just shut down, overriding the discomfort and the fear. You'd fall into a heavy, dreamless sleep, often waking hours later feeling just as tired as when you laid down, but having gained a few precious hours of unconsciousness. This wasn't restorative sleep. It was functional unconsciousness, a temporary reboot for a system running on fumes. You weren't sleeping well, you were simply unconscious enough to survive. Mainstream historical fact: chronic sleep deprivation was a constant state for many frontline soldiers. Studies conducted during and after the war confirmed that prolonged lack of quality sleep severely impacts reaction time, decision-making, cognitive function, and emotional regulation. Military planners understood the need for rest, but the realities of combat often made it impossible to provide adequate downtime, directly impacting troop effectiveness during prolonged engagements. An exhausted soldier is a less effective soldier, plain and simple. Soldiers developed coping mechanisms. Some tried to use whatever they could find as makeshift pillows, a rolled-up blanket, a helmet, a sandbag. Others would try to block out the noise by pulling their helmet low over their ears or burying their head. The rhythm of shared watches meant that someone was always awake, providing a thin layer of security that allowed others to drift off, however fitfully. A quirky tidbit: some soldiers became so adept at sleeping whenever and wherever possible that they could snatch moments of sleep while standing up, leaning against something, or even while riding in bumpy vehicles, their bodies conditioned by extreme fatigue to seize any opportunity for rest. It was a survival skill born purely out of desperate necessity. Historians still argue whether the cumulative impact of chronic sleep deprivation and the psychological stress of combat significantly contributed to the rates of combat fatigue, later known as shell shock or PTSD, experienced by soldiers, or if these were primarily direct results of traumatic experiences independent of sleep patterns. Was the constant state of exhaustion a contributing factor to long-term mental health issues, or simply a temporary physical burden? It's a complex web of cause and effect, but nobody doubts that the lack of rest made everything harder. You learn to value even the shortest periods of uninterrupted sleep. An hour here, 2 hours there. It's not enough, never enough, but it's something. You wake up stiff, cold, and still tired, but for a little while you weren't here. You weren't in the mud, you weren't in danger, you weren't hungry or thirsty or dirty. You were simply unconscious. And sometimes, that brief escape was just enough to face another day of the relentless grind. The search for comfort, like the search for clean water or a hot meal, was a constant, often futile, pursuit. You were always just one step away from exhaustion, one step away from collapse, held together by sheer will and the desperate need to survive until the next, inadequate period of rest. You close your eyes again, hoping against hope for just another minute of oblivion before the world intrudes once more. You've spent the night wrestling with the hard ground in your own anxious thoughts, managing only a few hours of that restless, unsatisfying sleep. You wake up stiff, cold, and still bone-tired, every muscle screaming in protest, the persistent itch of dirt, and maybe unwelcome tiny passengers already making themselves known. You reach for your canteen, take a sip of that faintly chemical water, and then you begin the familiar, uncomfortable process of getting ready for the day. But getting ready isn't about picking out clothes from a closet. It's about adjusting the layers of your life that you carry on your body, day in and day out. Because beyond the food in your mess kit and the water in your canteen, the most fundamental part of your daily existence is the gear you wear and carry, a heavy, cumbersome extension of yourself that is both your protection and your burden. Your uniform. For most Allied soldiers, this meant wool. Thick, scratchy, often olive drab or khaki wool. It was designed to be durable, to provide warmth in cold weather, and to offer some basic camouflage. But comfortable? Not in the slightest. In the heat, it was stifling, trapping sweat and turning you into a walking sauna. In the wet, it absorbed water like a sponge, becoming heavy, cold, and taking forever to dry, contributing to that perpetual damp chill that seemed to settle deep in your bones. It chafed, it itched, and it held on to every speck of dirt, every stain, every unpleasant smell. Your uniform wasn't just clothing, it was a second skin made of discomfort, a constant physical reminder of your miserable circumstances. You might get issued different weights or types depending on the climate, lighter cotton twills for the Pacific or North Africa, heavier wools for Europe or the Ardennes, but the principle was the same: functional, durable, and rarely, if ever, comfortable. Beneath the uniform? Layers. Long johns, if you were lucky enough to have them and the weather warranted it. A cotton undershirt. And then the uniform itself: trousers, shirt, maybe a wool sweater or jacket, and an outer field jacket or coat. Layering was key to trying to manage body temperature, but it also meant more weight, more bulk, and more laundry that would never get done. You wore the same clothes for days, weeks, sometimes even longer. Changing underwear was a rare luxury, often done in secret, with the clean pair usually just the slightly less dirty one you'd worn before. Let's just say personal freshness was not a high priority, or even a low one. And then there were the boots. Oh, the boots. Your connection to the ground, your means of propulsion, and often, the source of debilitating misery. Military-issue boots were designed for durability and support, often made of heavy leather. But breaking them in was agony, and keeping your feet healthy inside them was a constant battle. Remember that trench foot we talked about? That was the direct consequence of living and fighting in cold, wet conditions without being able to keep your feet dry and warm. Your socks were just as important as your boots, ideally wool, changed frequently, but clean, dry socks were like winning the lottery. You'd cherish a dry pair, maybe even sleep with them inside your jacket to warm them with body heat, hoping against hope they'd stay dry for more than an hour once your boots went back on. Ill-fitting boots, worn-down soles, blisters, athlete's foot, infected sores. Your feet took a beating, and their condition directly impacted your ability to march, to move, to fight. A soldier with bad feet was a liability, unable to keep up. On your head, a steel helmet. Heavy, awkward, but potentially life-saving. You wore it constantly when there was any risk of shell fire or shrapnel. It wasn't just for protection, it was a seat, a makeshift bucket, a pillow, a very uncomfortable one, a place to stash things under the netting or cover. When not wearing the helmet, you might have a softer garrison cap or a wool knit cap for warmth. Now, the weight. You didn't just wear your clothes, you carried your entire life on your back, or rather, distributed across your body. Your pack, your rifle, your ammunition, grenades, bayonet, entrenching tool, a small folding shovel, essential for digging those miserable foxholes, gas mask and carrier. Even if the threat of gas seemed remote, you carried it: mess kit, canteen, first aid pouch, maybe binoculars, maps, spare socks, letters from home, cigarettes, matches, and your current ration issue. This wasn't a light load. Depending on the army and the role, a soldier could easily be carrying 50, 60, even 80 pounds of gear. Imagine walking miles, digging, running, fighting, with the equivalent of a small person strapped to you. Every pound felt like 10 after a few hours. Mainstream historical fact: the average load carried by an infantry soldier in World War II significantly exceeded the weight deemed sustainable for long-term health and effectiveness by modern ergonomic standards. This heavy burden contributed to exhaustion, injuries, and reduced mobility, particularly during long marches or assaults. That entrenching tool? It wasn't just for digging. It was a weapon in close combat, a makeshift seat, a surface to rest your mess kit on, a tool for everything from clearing brush to opening stubborn crates. It was one of those utterly indispensable items you never wanted to be without. The gas mask, on the other hand, was often seen as dead weight, a bulky, uncomfortable item that rarely proved necessary but had to be carried anyway, taking up valuable space and adding pounds. You learned to live with its awkward presence, bumping against your hip or chest. Personal items were tucked into pockets or pouches: a small photo of a loved one, a lucky charm, maybe a rabbit's foot or a religious medallion, a pen and paper for writing letters, a small knife, maybe a deck of cards if you were lucky. These small, non-essential items were disproportionately important, offering a psychological link to home and a sense of individual identity in a world that tried to strip it away. A quirky tidbit: some soldiers would carry a small, worn copy of a favorite book or even a musical instrument like a harmonica, holding on to these fragile pieces of their former lives against the overwhelming reality of war, pulling them out in rare moments of quiet to find a fleeting escape. Historians still argue whether the design and issue of personal equipment, particularly the weight carried by infantry soldiers, significantly impacted battlefield outcomes by affecting troop endurance, speed, and tactical flexibility, or if soldiers simply adapted to the burden as another unavoidable hardship of war. Was the difference between a 60-pound load and a 50-pound load enough to sway the outcome of a battle? It's a question where human resilience meets logistical practicality. Every buckle, every strap, every pocket, every seam of your uniform and gear was a part of your daily struggle. You learned to adjust things just so, to distribute the weight unevenly, to give one part of your body a temporary break, to live with the constant pressure and friction. Your body became accustomed to the burden, but it never stopped protesting entirely. This wasn't just about carrying the tools of war. It was about carrying the physical manifestation of your daily existence, a heavy, uncomfortable shell that protected you, enabled you, and wore you down, pound by relentless pound. You've adjusted the straps on your heavy pack, pulled your scratchy wool uniform straight, and laced up those perpetually uncomfortable boots, feeling the familiar ache in your feet. You've accepted the constant burden of the gear you carry, the physical manifestation of your life here in the dirt and the danger. Your body is weary, your mind is numb from the constant stress and lack of sleep, and the simple, physical reality of existence here is grinding you down, pound by relentless pound, itch by relentless itch. But there's another weight you carry, a different kind of burden, but also your greatest source of strength and connection to the world you left behind. That weight is the anticipation of mail. In a world stripped down to the brutal essentials of survival, food, water, shelter, or the lack thereof, and fighting, a letter from home was a lifeline. It wasn't just paper and ink. It was a tangible piece of everything you were fighting for, a connection to the people who loved you, who worried about you, who were living a life that felt increasingly distant and unreal compared to your own. Receiving mail was an event. The arrival of the mail truck or the mail bag was greeted with a surge of desperate hope. Men would gather around, eyes scanning the names as the sergeant or mail clerk sorted through the precious cargo. Your heart would pound in your chest. Was there something for you? Today? Please let it be today. Getting mail to the front lines was a logistical miracle in itself. It involved ships crossing submarine-infested oceans, trains rumbling through bombed-out landscapes, trucks navigating treacherous roads, and sometimes, finally, a soldier walking miles across muddy fields or through dense jungle to reach your specific unit, wherever it happened to be dug in. It was a slow, often unpredictable process. Letters could take weeks, sometimes months, to arrive. Packages were even slower and more likely to be lost or damaged. The military postal service worked tirelessly, processing millions upon millions of letters and parcels, a hidden, vital artery pumping emotional blood to the fighting men and women. Sometimes you'd receive a bundle of letters all at once, covering weeks of your family's life back home, creating a strange, compressed snapshot of time. Other times, nothing for weeks, leaving you feeling utterly cut off, forgotten. Reading a letter was a deeply personal, often emotional act. You'd find a quiet corner, away from the general noise and chaos if possible, and unfold the thin V-mail paper or the regular stationery. The smell of the paper, maybe faintly carrying the scent of home, a mother's perfume, a sister's laundry soap, the familiar air of your own house, could be overwhelming. You'd read the words, written by a familiar hand, describing everyday things. Mrs. Henderson down the street got a new dog, the garden is doing well this year, your kids said something funny, they saw a movie you used to like. These mundane details, so ordinary in peacetime, were gold to you now. They were proof that life continued, that there was a world beyond the mud and the fighting, a world waiting for you to return to. They were also a poignant reminder of everything you were missing. Writing letters was just as important, maybe even more so. It was your way of reaching back, of maintaining that connection. Finding the time, the paper, often thin, flimsy email forms or whatever scraps you could find, a pen or pencil, and the mental energy to write was a challenge. What do you say? How do you describe this life without terrifying them? You couldn't tell them about the close calls, the fear, the constant misery, the things you'd seen. So you wrote about the weather, about the food, or lack thereof, maybe with a touch of humor, about your buddies, about hoping the war would end soon. You asked about home, filling pages with questions about the garden, the dog, the neighbors, anything to keep them writing back. You poured your longing and your love into those carefully chosen words, censoring the reality of your existence to protect them, creating a parallel, sanitized narrative for the folks back home. It was an act of emotional engineering, a way to bridge the vast, dangerous gap between your world and theirs. Mainstream historical fact: the military postal service in World War II was one of the largest and most complex logistical operations undertaken, processing an estimated 10 to 15 billion pieces of mail during the war. The volume of mail was seen as so critical to troop morale that immense resources were dedicated to ensuring its delivery, even into combat zones. The content of letters was often subject to censorship, both by the military and by the soldiers themselves. Official censors would read letters to prevent the leakage of sensitive information about unit locations, movements, or casualties. Soldiers self-censored to spare their families worry and to maintain a facade of normalcy. This meant letters from the front were often frustratingly vague about the realities of combat, focusing instead on the mundane or the humorous aspects of daily life. You might read a letter from your brother in another unit and realize you were both carefully avoiding mentioning the same terrifying events you knew you'd both experienced in the same area. A quirky tidbit, V-Mail, Victory Mail, was a system developed primarily by the US and UK to save space and weight when shipping mail overseas. Soldiers would write letters on special forms, which were then microfilmed, shipped as tiny rolls of film, and then printed out on smaller paper near the destination for delivery. This drastically reduced the volume of mail being shipped, making it faster and more efficient, though it did mean you received a somewhat impersonal, reduced-size copy of the original letter. Historians still argue whether the morale boosts provided by regular mail delivery significantly impacted troop endurance and willingness to fight during long, difficult campaigns, or if its psychological effects were secondary to factors like leadership, unit cohesion, and the perceived justness of the cause. Was the emotional lifeline of letters from home a critical component of resilience, or simply a temporary comfort in an otherwise unbearable situation? Sometimes the news from home wasn't good. A letter might bring news of illness, death, or heartbreak that you were powerless to do anything about, thousands of miles away. Receiving bad news in the isolation of the front could be devastating, adding another layer of grief and helplessness to your already heavy load. But even then, the letter was a connection, painful as it might be. You finish reading the letter, folding it carefully and tucking it away with the others, a small, precious bundle of memories and hope. You pick up your pen and a V-mail form, thinking about what you can possibly write today that will sound cheerful and reassuring. It's hard to find the words when your reality is so far removed from theirs. But you try. Because that letter, traveling across oceans and continents, through mud and danger, is more than just mail. It's a piece of home, a reminder of why you're here, and the promise, however faint, that there is still a world waiting for you to come back to. It is, in many ways, as vital as the air you breathe. You've folded that precious letter from home, tucking it carefully away, a physical link to the world you left behind, a reminder of the love and hope that fuels you more than any ration ever could. That emotional lifeline is vital, but in the day-to-day grind, you also need smaller, more immediate comforts, little moments of pleasure or distraction that help you forget, just for a few minutes, where you are and what you're doing. These were the small comforts and vices, the items that weren't strictly necessary for survival in the biological sense, but were absolutely essential for surviving in the human sense. Top of the list, for a huge number of soldiers, was cigarettes. They were everywhere. Issued in rations, available at PX stores and rear areas, traded like currency at the front. For many, smoking wasn't just a habit. It was a ritual, a way to mark time, a shared activity that bonded men together in moments of stress or downtime. Lighting a cigarette after a tense patrol, or sharing one with a buddy in the quiet hours before dawn, was a small act of defiance against the chaos, a brief return to a familiar, calming routine. The pack in your pocket wasn't just tobacco, it was potential trade goods, a source of fire. Those waterproof matches in your accessory pack were often used for lighting smokes, and a psychological crutch. Even non-smokers often kept their cigarette ration. They were too valuable as trading chips to discard. You could swap cigarettes for extra food, a better place to sleep, or almost anything else you needed or wanted. It was the informal currency of the front lines. A quirkier tidbit here. Soldiers would often flatten cigarette packs and use the cardboard for writing small notes, or even drawing maps on. The humble cigarette pack served multiple purposes beyond holding smokes. Beyond the cigarettes, there was the sweet stuff. Chocolate was a highly prized item. The USK ration included a chocolate bar, but it was a special, high melting point formulation designed not to melt in tropical heat. This meant it was often hard, waxy, and not particularly pleasant to eat, more like a functional energy block than a treat. However, any chocolate was better than no chocolate. C-rations sometimes included a small canned dessert that might have chocolate in it. Packages from home often contained real, melt-in-your-mouth chocolate bars or cookies, which were devoured or carefully rationed out. British and Commonwealth rations also sometimes included chocolate or boiled sweets, hard candies. These weren't just about satisfying a sweet tooth. Sugar provided quick energy, a welcome boost when you were running on empty, and the taste was a fleeting reminder of a sweeter life back home. Chewing gum was another ubiquitous item, particularly in U.S. rations. It didn't provide calories, but it helped keep your mouth moist when water was scarce, gave you something to do when you were bored or nervous, and the act of chewing could be surprisingly calming. It was a small, portable distraction, a tiny bit of normalcy in an abnormal world. You'd chew it until the flavor was long gone, then chew it some more. Other small items provided similar boosts. Hard candies, like peppermints or fruit drops, offered a burst of flavor and sugar. Sometimes you'd get a small tin of condensed milk or jam in a ration, which could transform those awful hard biscuits into something almost palatable. Access to things like extra soap, often scarce, or clean socks, a true luxury, also fell into this category of small comforts. They weren't food, but they dramatically improved your physical state and, by extension, your morale. Think about how good it feels to put on a pair of clean socks after days in the same damp ones. It's a small thing, but it feels huge in the moment. Mainstream historical fact. Recognizing the vital role of these non-essential items in maintaining morale, military logistics systems dedicated significant resources to ensuring their supply, even prioritizing items like cigarettes, candy, and soft drinks, when available in rear areas, alongside food and ammunition. Understanding that a soldier's psychological state was as important as his physical readiness. These small comforts weren't just individual pleasures, they were social lubricants. Sharing a cigarette, trading a chocolate bar for a can of beans, offering a piece of gum, these were small acts of camaraderie that reinforced the bonds between soldiers. They provided opportunities for interaction, for negotiation, even if it was just haggling over a biscuit, and for shared moments of simple enjoyment in a harsh environment. You learned who hoarded their chocolate and who was generous with their cigarettes, and these small observations built the intricate social web of the squad. Historians still argue whether the provision and availability of these small comforts and vices significantly impacted the rates of disciplinary issues or combat effectiveness among troops, or if their primary effect was limited to individual psychological coping and temporary morale boosts without broader strategic implications. Was the widespread availability of cigarettes a net positive for morale despite the obvious health risks, or did it create dependencies that caused problems? It's hard to quantify the exact impact of a shared cigarette or a piece of chocolate on the outcome of a battle, but ask any veteran, and they'll tell you these little things mattered. The desire for these items also fueled that informal economy we talked about earlier. Trading official rations for preferred brands of cigarettes, scrounging for anything sweet, hoping desperately for a care package from home, the craving for these small luxuries was a constant, low-level motivator. It added a layer of complexity to the daily grind, turning soldiers into amateur economists and traders, always looking for an edge, always hoping to swap something they hated for something they desired. It was a small game of chance played out in the mud, with the stakes being a momentary escape from the grim reality. You might be covered in dirt, exhausted, hungry, and constantly scanning for danger, but if you had a cigarette to light, a piece of chocolate to savor, or a stick of gum to chew, you had a tiny piece of control, a small comfort you could administer to yourself. These items were more than just physical objects. They were symbols of resilience, tokens of a world where simple pleasures existed, and small reminders that even in the most brutal circumstances, humanity finds ways to seek comfort, connection, and a fleeting moment of sweetness. You finish your cigarette, the ash mingling with the dirt at your feet, and for a moment, just a brief moment, the edge of the hardship feels just a little bit duller. You've just found a fleeting moment of solace in a cigarette, or a promised bite of chocolate, a tiny island of comfort in the vast, gray sea of your daily existence. You've felt the rough texture of the wool uniform, the persistent ache in your feet inside those heavy boots, the constant, low-grade irritation of dirt, and the unseen life it harbors. You've tasted the waxy disappointment of the K-ration, the slightly more hopeful but still monotonous contents of the C-ration can, the salty resilience of bully beef, the dense, earthy flavor of German Kommissbrot, and the bland potential of Japanese dried rice, always needing water you might not have. You've endured the medicinal tang of purified water and craved the simple luxury of a hot drink. You've wrestled with the hard ground for a few hours of inadequate sleep, your mind buzzing with the twin anxieties of danger and the sheer physical misery of your surroundings. You've carried the crushing weight of your gear, every pound a reminder of the burden of this life. You've clung to letters from home like a drowning man to driftwood, a vital emotional link across an impossible distance. This is the grinding daily existence. This isn't the stuff of headlines or medals. It's the relentless, repetitive, utterly exhausting business of simply being a soldier in World War II, day after day, week after week, month after month. Combat was terrifying, brutal, and demanded everything you had, but combat was often episodic. The daily grind, the constant low-level struggle against discomfort, deprivation, and disease, was the baseline reality. It was the backdrop against which those terrifying moments of battle were painted. And it wore you down in a way that was perhaps less dramatic than a bullet or shrapnel, but just as insidious, chipping away at your physical and mental reserves, leaving you perpetually tired, perpetually dirty, and perpetually hungry for something, anything, better. Think about the cumulative effect. Your body is constantly undernourished in terms of variety and freshness, even if the calorie count is technically sufficient. You feel the dull ache of hunger or the bloating discomfort of processed food that doesn't sit right. Your digestion is probably a mess. You are chronically sleep-deprived, operating in a fog of fatigue that dulls your senses and slows your reactions. Every movement is an effort, weighted down by your gear and the sheer weariness in your bones. You are perpetually itchy, battling dirt, sweat, and parasites that feel like they've set up a permanent colony on your skin. You smell yourself, you smell your comrades, you smell the unwashed uniforms and the damp earth, and it's a smell that becomes the scent of your life. It's a bouquet of misery, really. The lack of privacy is total. You live, eat, sleep, and perform necessary bodily functions in close proximity to dozens, sometimes hundreds, of other men. There is no solitude, no personal space to retreat to, nowhere to simply be alone with your thoughts, unless you count the brief, terrifying isolation of being on watch in the dark. Even your most intimate struggles, like trying to pick lice off your body or dealing with a bout of dysentery, are often public performances. It erodes that sense of individual dignity you carried with you from home. You become part of a collective mass, defined by your uniform and your shared hardship. The monotony of the rations, the endless repetition of the same few flavors and textures, wasn't just boring, it was psychologically draining. Food is supposed to be a source of pleasure, comfort, and cultural connection. When it's reduced to mere fuel, consumed out of necessity rather than desire, It strips away another layer of what it means to be human. You dream of fresh bread, of a home-cooked meal, of a cold glass of milk, and those dreams highlight the stark, unappealing reality of the canned, waxy, processed substances you are forced to consume. Remember that waxy K-ration cheese? It wasn't just food, it was a symbol of the bland, unyielding nature of your daily fare. Mainstream historical fact. While military training focused heavily on combat skills and tactics, the ability of soldiers to endure and adapt to severe environmental conditions, chronic deprivation, and psychological stress in non-combat situations was increasingly recognized as a critical factor in maintaining long-term unit effectiveness and preventing collapse from attrition due to illness, exhaustion, and psychological breakdown. It was the capacity to tolerate the daily misery that often determined who could stay in the fight. The moments of comfort, the rare hot meal, a letter from home, a shared cigarette, a piece of chocolate, became disproportionately significant. They were tiny cracks in the wall of hardship, brief glimpses of a different world, enough to cling to, enough to remind you why you were enduring all of this. They weren't luxuries. They were necessities for the soul, small acts of resistance against a reality that sought to dehumanize you through constant discomfort and deprivation. A quirky tidbit. Soldiers sometimes developed elaborate, almost ritualistic ways of preparing their meager rations, like carefully heating a can of stew over a tiny stove, or crumbling biscuits into hot water with sugar, turning the act of eating into a small, mindful ceremony that provided a sense of control and purpose in a world where you had very little of either. Historians still argue whether the cumulative psychological and physical toll of these non-combat hardships, independent of direct combat exposure, significantly contributed to the rates of psychological casualties and long-term health issues experienced by veterans, or if the resilience built by enduring such conditions actually served as a protective factor against some forms of trauma. Was the daily grind itself a form of trauma, or did it prepare you for the shock of battle? You learned to live with it. You learned to ignore the constant itch, the perpetual ache, the gnawing hunger, the bone-deep fatigue. You learned to find tiny moments of relief and cling to them fiercely. You learned to derive grim humor from the absurdity of your situation, to joke about the taste of the rations or the impossibility of getting clean. You learned to rely on the men around you, because they are the only ones who truly understand this specific brand of misery. This is the foundation of unit cohesion, built not just on shared danger, but on shared discomfort, shared hunger, shared sleeplessness, shared jokes about ham and lima beans. This wasn't the heroic charge or the desperate defense you read about in history books. This was the vast, unseen majority of a soldier's time in war, the waiting, the enduring, the constant, low-grade battle against the environment, against your own body's protests, against the soul-sapping monotony and discomfort. It was the dirt under your fingernails, the ache in your feet, the taste of regret in your mouth, and the desperate hope for a few hours of oblivion. It was the grind. And it was, in its own quiet, relentless way, just as much a part of the war as the battles themselves. As the night deepens, and the sounds of the front line soften slightly, you pull your scratchy blanket tighter around you. The cold seeps in, or maybe it's the damp heat that clings to everything. The smell of mud and unwashed bodies hangs in the air. Your stomach makes a quiet protest. You can feel the lumps and bumps of the ground beneath you, hard and unyielding. But the exhaustion is a heavy cloak, pulling you down, away from the conscious world. The worries of the day, the anxieties about tomorrow, the constant physical discomforts, they begin to fade, just a little, as the need for rest takes over. You close your eyes, letting the sounds of the night become a distant hum, the feeling of dirt and grime a dull sensation you can almost ignore. Breathe slowly. In and out. The weight of the gear, the ache in your muscles, the itch on your skin, let them soften around the edges of your awareness. The world is quietening now. The images of the day, the faces, the sounds, the smells, they are drifting away. You are just here now, breathing, resting, letting the darkness hold you for a little while. There is nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to be, just this moment of stillness. Sleep is coming. Let it wash over you, a gentle tide carrying you away from the shore of wakefulness. You are safe for now. Just rest. Let go.